BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Alright, so as you see today, we're going to be continuing onward with our discussion about Thomas Henry Horan and the Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986. And you can see here that this is listed as part number 5. If you haven't heard the previous segments, that's fine. You can keep listening, because we're just having a little bit of a discussion about the Zodiac Killer, as well as a very large alternative theory. And that's really what I can say about the book so far. We've been going through the Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986, and what it seems with this one is that the thesis is that Robert Graysmith wrote Zodiac in 1986, right? And what Thomas Henry Horan is trying to do is pretty much write a debunking companion to that Zodiac book. And everything that we've covered in the early chapters has pretty much just been talking about how Graysmith said this in 1986, but it turns out that that's not true because ... and Thomas Henry Horan gives his explanations about what he believes is closer to a historical narrative. But I think it's actually a very interesting way to present this type of information, because this really comes more about Robert Graysmith more so than anything else, and it's really trying to highlight that by Horan's own admission that Graysmith was a habitual liar, and he was intentionally misrepresenting Zodiac facts, or perhaps completely fabricating other Zodiac facts altogether. But why don't we pick up where we left off, and let's continue onward with our discussion. First, we're going to begin by reading something that Horan has highlighted in block text from Robert Graysmith himself. So when we read these first words here, these are written by Graysmith. Thursday, February 27th, 1969. Darlene was in the bathroom, putting on her makeup, to go out when Karen told her about the stranger. "What did the car look like?" Darlene asked. Karen told her, "I guess he's checking up on me again. I heard he was back from out of state." Darlene paused. "He doesn't want anyone to know what I saw him do," she said. "I saw him murder someone." Darlene mentioned a man's name, a short common name, but Karen didn't hear. She was too quiet. She was too intent on the fact that Darlene was obviously frightened of that stranger. And, according to Horan, Graysmith here tries to make both people out to be the same suspect. And what we're talking about is, he's trying to say that somebody's stalking Darlene Farren, but at the same time, someone's checking up on her. And as you heard right there, that sounds like kind of a bombshell to drop, that Darlene Farren seems to be somewhat casually mentioning to somebody that she saw someone murder somebody in the past. What we can say about Darlene Farren, and just pulling on some other Zodiac sources, is she has kind of a past that has some plot holes in it. I believe I heard Thomas Horan say himself previously that Darlene Farren had 6 months of her life that just very few people knew about, that she refused to talk about. What they believe is that she was kind of running around the world with a guy who was, paying for her, prior to being married, of course. And a couple people have written into this little show here talking about how that guy was actually a merchant marine, and he was someone who was in his 50s. One person left to me several comments that were very long, very lengthy comments talking about Darlene Farren was involved with a 50-year-old merchant marine, and they're identifying that person as the Zodiac Killer. This is tied to something called the Tarbox Confession, where a lawyer named Tarbox, that's his last name, easy name to remember, right, Tarbox, he had someone who claimed to be a merchant marine come into his office, claimed to be the Zodiac Killer. He gave him his name, said he was a merchant marine, and says, just pretty much, he's the Zodiac Killer, and I want you to be my attorney, and that he was never seen again. If I've gotten that as well as I could in just a little bit of a nutshell sentence. Well, what I would say about that is that I'd like to investigate that more, and I really hope in the future we can do an entire segment just on the Tarbox confession to see if there's something going on with that. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. Just from this little snippet that we've just read, Darlene Farren seemed to have some people that were involved in her past that were up to no good, for lack of a better term. So that's the first thing we would say. And, a lot of people, you find this a lot of the times when you're dealing with true crime cases, someone who turns out to be a victim, it's almost just like it's a matter of time before it happened. They had so many problems in their life. They were just kind of the epicenter of criminal activity. Not to say that they had that much connection to it, but so many people were out to get them. They had connections with various destructive individuals. The man Karen noticed watching the Farren apartment from his car was in fact a neighbor of theirs, Richard Moncourt. The second man, the one recently back from out of state, supposedly checking up on Darlene Farren, was probably her first husband, Jim Phillips Crabtree. Whether Darlene actually told anyone that she ever witnessed any murder, she definitely had... Well, yes, that's kind of a weird sentence. She had definitely divorced Jim at least partly out of fear, and she was careful not to give him her current address or telephone number. The one time Darlene needed Jim to sign some papers, she found him in San Francisco and met him there, rather than asking him to contact her. And Thomas Horan cites that he got that from Jim Phillips Crabtree himself. Now, I actually wanted to say something about that because, following some Zodiac forums and stuff, I even saw one person years ago saying that he knew Jim Phillips Crabtree personally and he had talked to him about the Zodiac case. So the thing that I would have said even before that is that Crabtree seemed rather open about talking about things and discussing things, and people who had access to him were not known to be turned away. And Horan is citing Jim Phillips Crabtree as this source right here, but I don't think Jim Phillips Crabtree would have confessed to murdering anyone to Thomas Henry Horan. But Horan still kind of speculates that perhaps if there was any discussion about murder, then it could have been Crabtree that they were referencing. But I don't know about you guys. When I read that sentence, and it's just like, it's the thing from Robert Graysmith. I saw him murder someone, Darlene mentioned. I mean, talk about a loaded sentence, like boom, like, as we said, that's a real, how many times do you hear that in your personal life? Oh, hey, yeah, see that man outside in that car over there? Saw him murder someone. I know it sounds kind of silly when we say it like that, but just when we've kind of picked up, it's kind of a bizarre thing to say. And I think Horan is even expressing doubts that comment was ever uttered by Darlene Farren, but let's keep on going. The description of the man Karen said she noticed watching the Farren apartment does not match that of Moncourt. It does, however, match one given to the police by the surviving victim, Mike Mageau, of the man he said shot him and Darlene. Both witnesses gave police a perfect description of Crabtree, especially of how he appeared in 1969. Crabtree's status as a suspect in Darlene's death will be examined in more detail when reading Graysmith's passage devoted to him. Now, guys, correct me if I'm wrong. Going off of memory completely, I believe that Michael Mageau was given a lineup of photos of Zodiac suspects, and he pointed out Arthur Lee Allen. I think that's what happened. So, I mean, I'm just saying, I'm pretty sure I saw that in one of the Zodiac documentaries or on one of the videos that Michael Mageau pointed out. Arthur Lee Allen said, that's the man who attacked me. But he says that he gives a description of that of Jim Phillips Crabtree. Graysmith here places great emphasis on the description of his suspect because it closely matches Mageau's. Okay, well then, boom, okay, taken care of. All right, Graysmith is saying that his suspect, remember, Graysmith's suspect is Arthur Lee Allen. He has used two aliases, and, the first one was Andrew Todd Walker, but then I always mix it up. It was Robert Starr Hall was the second one that he used for Arthur Lee Allen, but it's just, that's just an alias. And yes, he says here that they seem very similar. However, as we shall see, he later completely falsifies the description by a San Francisco police officer of a man he saw near the scene of Paul Stein's murder in order to make it fit this description. A description which Graysmith first claims matches that of Grant and then later of Arthur Lee Allen. Here Graysmith ignores the fact that it is a description of Jim Phillips Crabtree. Just for good measure, Graysmith concludes this section of Chapter 2 by inserting mention of a man who is in fact yet a third is written in italics, distinctly different suspect. When Darlene Farren dropped by Terry's restaurant that night, she was told a stocky man had been asking questions about her. The stocky man who had been pestering Darlene Farren at work and at home was, according to several witnesses, very definitively a Filipino American bartender named George Waters, who was cleared by the police as a suspect in the shooting. Well, you see, though, just a stocky man. I mean, was it George Costanza as well or something like that? It's a very vague description. But the things that Horan really tries to do is he tries to go back and connect with other witnesses and other people and find out, okay, you're hearing this description of a stocky man. Well, who was he? And I really do commend him for going back and talking to these people. And, I mean, according to Horan, that was just a Filipino-American bartender named George Waters and had no involvement in Darlene Farren's murder or perhaps any of the other pieces of Zodiac activity. Granted, I mean, I think all parties are kind of in agreement that the Zodiac killer was not Filipino-American. I mean, we're talking about things like the composite sketch. We're talking about, various eyewitness statements. So, I mean, I'm just saying, you guys know all that, of course. I have to tell you, though, if Horan has highlighted anything, and I'm not saying that I endorse his theory or that I agree with him 100%. In fact, during the Lake Herman Road stuff, I really took exception to a lot of the things that he had said. But when you look at this stuff here, what he's really trying to show is that there are a lot of vague statements that are going on, especially when you look at Darlene Farren and her life, and you just have things like, oh, a man was bothering her at the restaurant, and people are like, well, who could that have been? Was it Arthur Lee Allen, or Lawrence Kane, or George Russell Tucker, or Louis Myers? I mean, when you have all of these things, like, they just trying to fit that in to the narrative. And I think that he's trying to show that there are lots of holes in the Zodiac case because of very vague descriptions of the events and trying to provide a little bit of clarity to the descriptions of the events. But, I mean, I'm not saying I completely endorse his theory 100%, but I do have to say that there's some interesting stuff in this book. Okay, Graysmith later refers to the Filipino-American as Paul the bartender, as though he were completely different from the one mentioned in the paragraph that we talked about recently. I'm paraphrasing some of Horan's stuff so it'll sound better on the audio. But yes, like he's trying to talk about him in relation to somebody else, just saying that he's Paul the bartender. And the very same reports that Graysmith used to write this section show unmistakably that they refer to 3 different men. They're also the same pages that Graysmith used to write later chapters discussing these same 3 men as though they were entirely separate from the fictional composite suspect presented in Chapter 2. There is 0 doubt that he saw these files, and 0 doubt he is simply lying about them extensively in order to help construct the phony Zodiac killer. Wow, talk about a slap in the face or something like that to Robert Graysmith. But what Horan is saying is that Robert Graysmith is taking descriptions of 3 different people and trying to make people think that it is one person. Okay, so that's kind of the heart and soul of Thomas Henry Horan's thesis statement, really, is that there were multiple murders that took place and that people created this narrative to try and link things together. And he's really talking a lot about Robert Graysmith, but later on we're going to get to some discussions about another individual who could be involved named Hal Snook. Saturday, March 15th, 1969, Pam Soonan, Darlene's younger sister, had previously found 2 packages on the doorstep of the Farrens' home, but she had never seen them. Who'd left them? However, today she opened the front door in time to see a man in horn-rimmed glasses delivering a 3rd package. She had seen him before, parked in front of the house in a white car, and he told me, Pam remembered, that under no circumstances was I to look in that package. He stayed outside the door. He stayed outside in his car for the longest time after he delivered the package. When Darlene Farren came home, she asked if anything had come for her. I gave her the package and she took it back into the room, and when I asked her what it was, she didn't say anything. From that point on, she seemed different. She was very nervous, and she took the phone into the bedroom, made a phone call, and then she rushed out, and she took me home real fast. Pam was finally able to learn that the first package contained a silver belt and a purse from Mexico, and the second package, a white flower print fabric. Darlene Farren planned to make the fabric into a jumpsuit. And we mentioned some of this in Part 4 when we were talking about Darlene Farren was found dead wearing a blue and white flower-patterned slack dress. And a slack dress is the one-piece jumpsuit that has pant legs that form into the bell-bottom shape at the bottom. And someone even wrote a description of it on Mill Magazine, saying that if you were to see somebody, like, from a distance, you would not know that they were wearing pants. You would think that they were wearing a dress. It's like, even, like, at first glance, you would probably think that someone was wearing a dress and you wouldn't be able to distinguish the pant legs. But, of course, if someone had fallen down, I think you'd be able to see rather clearly. Okay, well, that segment about the packages was, of course, from Robert Graysmith. So let's see what Horan's response is. The first problem with this entire story is that it was remembered by Pam Soonen, a notoriously unreliable witness. Now, how many times have we said that on the channel? Darlene Farren's sister was accused multiple times of fabricating things to get on talk shows. She was just notoriously unreliable. That much I do agree with. From completely unrelated things, nothing to do with Thomas Horan, just when we looked into Darlene's sister, and when we did the discussion about the Darlene Farren conspiracies, and I was actually tipped off by somebody in the comments section to look into Pam's credibility, and you just find that she had a huge history of also fabricating many of the details. Not to mention, though, what we already said about Darlene Farren, that she had that 6-month gap in her life that people didn't really know all the details about it, so that also gives people the opportunity to project their own narrative onto Darlene Farren, and these are perhaps some of the reasons why Darlene Farren becomes the epicenter of Zodiac conspiracy. According to Darlene's older and more reliable sister Linda, the presents from Mexico were from Darlene's female friend Lee Proctor, who was not a scary character and who did not leave mysterious presents on the doorstep. The Proctors were a family from Texas who befriended Linda when she, and Linda referring to the older sister, they befriended Linda when she lived there with their daughter, Lee, and would bring the Soonen girls presents from Texas and Mexico when she visited relatives and friends in Vallejo. Okay, though, so, I don't think that's a controversial statement. Both of those sound like somewhat plausible explanations. I'd say Horan's is a simpler explanation. That's definitely the simpler thing. To make matters worse, Graysmith claims that Lee was Arthur Lee Allen. Oh, wow, the plot thickens. And, yes, but I have to say, though, just reading this off here, Lee, the female friend, Lee Proctor, is spelled L-E-E, and as we know very clearly, Arthur Lee Allen wrote his name L-E-I-G-H. You're just looking at it right here in the text, and you can see very clearly that, did Arthur Lee Allen ever write Lee, L-E-E? I don't think so. But he did frequently go by Lee Allen. People always referred to him as Lee Allen when you look back at the interviews with people who knew him. But at the same time, that's a different spelling, and it seems like Horan has very easily identified Lee as Lee Proctor, a female friend that knew Darlene Farren's older sister. I think what Horan's trying to say is that Arthur Lee Allen was not harassing Darlene Farren. Darlene Farren's best girlfriend, Bobby Ramos, believed that Darlene Farren's first husband, Jim Phillips Crabtree, was the source of the presents from Mexico, and that he was the mysterious man who made Darlene Farren nervous. Well, Horan has just provided a different explanation. He said the presents came from Lee Proctor. However, it's not clear that Crabtree even knew Darlene's address in Vallejo. I find that hard to believe, but maybe. He had consistently expressed nothing but contempt and bitterness toward Darlene over the years. Well, how many years are they talking about? They weren't married that long. And it does seem extremely unlikely that Darlene would keep any gifts from Crabtree, even if he did send them. Ex-wife, that's all I can really say about that. I don't know how bitter their relationship was. Maybe only Crabtree can really talk about that. But what it sounds like is, if we just have to look at some of these things, and if this is the first upload that you heard and you just kind of jumped into the middle of some of this, it seems like Horan's statement is rather simpler in relation to Darlene Farren, that Graysmith is taking details that really happened, and it's kind of that whole concept of taking the true facts and unwinding them, and you're also adding on some other things, like creating the fictitious connections between the facts. Darlene Farren was murdered. At one time, Darlene Farren received 2 packages Therefore, like, you put something in the middle that he was from a strange, mysterious man that matched the description of Arthur Lee Allen. And that's kind of what he's accusing Graysmith of doing. Is Horan right about everything? Not necessarily, but I'd say that it's somewhat of a thoughtful alternative thing. Once again, I'm only saying not necessarily because I don't want to act like I think Thomas Horan is perfect in everything, and that this is the only possibility in Zodiac lore, that this is the only possibility in the narrative of the Zodiac Killer. A few things could have happened. But what I can say is we're going to keep going, and Thomas Horan's theory is starting to look simpler. And during the Q&A session in part 1, someone really disagreed with me when I said his theory was very complex. Granted, it does involve more people. I mean, you're involving more people, but when you have like the kind of individual events like that, his whole thing about these packages came from a friend of Darlene's sister, that starts to seem a lot simpler. Well, what do you think about anything we have to say, or if you have any comments at all about the Zodiac Killer, I would love to hear from you, and that's all for me now. Please drop any comment you want to share in the comment section below, and until next time.